Morning. Well, as you know, today is Palm Sunday. This is the day we commemorate Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. It's called Palm Sunday because of the palm branches that they waved before him and laid down on the ground in front of him as he rode. And this sort of thing, this sort of grand entrance, I guess, was pretty common in the ancient world. Anytime someone important would visit a city, the people of that city would come out to greet him and then escort him back into the city. And I was trying to think of, how we still love these big entrances in our culture today. I tried thinking of some sort of big entrance I could do to come up here on stage. I didn't have any ideas. That's not really my thing anyway. I asked First Service if they had any ideas, and no one gave me any. But we still love a big entrance. And in our culture today, we still love big entrances. I don't know if you guys watched the Super Bowl a few months ago, but if you remember the halftime show, Lady Gaga jumped off the roof of the stadium onto the field. I don't know if you remember that. That was a pretty big entrance. Every year we roll out the red carpet at the Oscars because we like for our actors and actresses to make a big entrance, and they walk up and they get their pictures taken because everyone wants to see what they're wearing or not wearing. And then anytime you're at a wedding, you're at the reception, the bridal party gets announced and they make a big entrance, or if you're at a Sweet 16, the court gets announced and they make their entrance. Think about the Thanksgiving Day parade. I'm sure some of you have been there. The largest parade in the world. Thousands of people come and line the streets to see the floats and the singers and the performers making their entrance. A few months ago, President Trump led his inaugural parade. We do this every time a president is sworn in. He takes his oath at the Capitol building and has his luncheon, and then he leads the inaugural parade down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. So none of these quite have the same meaning that Jesus' triumphal entry did, but we still love a big entrance today. And I actually think the very first inaugural parade sort of gets at what was happening during Jesus' triumphal entry. So this does date all the way back to George Washington, and I'm just going to read a description of that to you straight from the website of the Joint Congregational Committee on Inaugural Ceremonies. They say, George Washington took the oath of office on April 30th, 1789 in New York City. As he began his journey from Mount Vernon to New York City, local militias joined his procession as it passed through towns along the way. Once he arrived, members of the Continental Army, government officials, members of Congress, and prominent citizens escorted him to Federal Hall for his swearing-in ceremony. So it was a little bit different. Over the last 200 years, it's changed, and the president is sworn in, and then we have the parade. But initially, for Washington, the people joined him as he was making his way to be sworn in, and they escorted him to be sworn in, which actually gets us really close to what was happening during Jesus' triumphal entry. So that's what we're going to be studying today. If you have your Bibles, open them up to the Gospel of Luke. We're going to be in Luke chapter 19. And this month we're concluding our investigation of the Gospel of Luke. You know by now that in this Gospel, Luke is setting Jesus before us as a model of maturity and as an example of spiritual maturity. And as we read the Gospels, it challenges us and it changes us to be more like Jesus. It makes us mature the way Jesus was mature, and it teaches us what sort of Christian Jesus wants us to be. But today we're going to take a little bit different approach. Every week we've been trying to look at Jesus as our model and Jesus as our example. But the triumphal entry and riding into Jerusalem as the Messiah, I don't really see how that sets an example for us to follow. So we're actually going to take our example today from the crowds. And instead of giving us a good example, they're going to give us a bad example. And the crowds are going to show us how to not be mature in our faith. So hopefully you've found Luke chapter 19 by now. We're going to start in verse 28, but before we do, let's get a little context. This story is a turning point in Luke's gospel. It's a transition. We've been in the second main block of material in this gospel. We've been in chapters 10 through 19. This is where Jesus is teaching. This is the last 6 months of his ministry. He's in Judea, getting ready to die. And then with the triumphal entry, we have this transition into the last week of Jesus' life and into the last major section of material in Luke's gospel. And in chapters 20 through 24, we'll read about the last week of Jesus' life, including his death and his resurrection. So this is really a turning point in the gospel. And this story is also significant because it's shared in all 4 gospels. Now, I don't know if you realize, but apart from the stories about Jesus' death and resurrection, only 2 stories are recorded in all 4 Gospels. This is one of them, and the other one is when Jesus fed the 5,000. And the thing they both have in common is that after Jesus did both of these things, the crowds were ready to make him their king. John says in John chapter 6 that after he fed the 5,000, the crowds wanted to make him king by force. And what we see after he rides into Jerusalem is that the crowds are ready to escort him to the temple and swear him in as their king and Messiah. So, acknowledging that, let's go ahead and start in our passage. We're in Luke chapter 19, starting in verse 28. We already watched it all, but now we're going to take it a few verses at a time. After Jesus had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. As he approached Bethphage and Bethany at the hill called the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you'll find a colt tied there which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' tell him the Lord needs it." Those who were sent ahead went and found it just as he'd told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners asked them, "Why are you untying the colt?" They replied, "The Lord needs it." They brought it to Jesus, threw their cloaks on the colt, and put Jesus on it. So Luke says this happens after Jesus had said this. And if you go back to verse 11, we see what Jesus said. In verse 11, Luke says, "While they were listening to this, Jesus went on to tell them a parable because he was near Jerusalem, and the people thought that the kingdom of God was going to appear at once." So we're already seeing that the crowds were ready to receive Jesus, but they weren't quite ready to receive him in the right way. They still kind of had some wrong ideas about what was going to happen. So he tells them a parable to kind of set them straight, and then he goes to Jerusalem. And he's going to Jerusalem because it's his time to die. He knows his time has come, his hour has come. It's time for him to die on the cross. And again, this is the transition into the last week of his life. And he goes over the Mount of Olives. Now, the Mount of Olives is a 2,600-foot mountain east of Jerusalem. And this mountain becomes really important in the last week of Jesus' life. First, we have the triumphal entry where he goes up one side and down the other into Jerusalem. Then, later on this week, he's going to come back to the Mount of Olives and preach his sermon about the destruction of Jerusalem, which we spent a whole Sunday talking about. The Garden of Gethsemane was located on the Mount of Olives, and that's where Jesus spends the night praying before he's arrested, struggling in prayer. And not only that, 40 days after he rises from the dead, he ascends to heaven from the Mount of Olives. So this mountain is going to be very important through the rest of Jesus' life. And he sends his disciples on ahead. He tells them to untie a donkey and bring it back. And that seems a little weird, like they're just going to go find a donkey and bring it to him. But remember, Jesus has been traveling around in this area for 6 months. So he's got a lot of followers. He's got a lot of fans. This is probably a local supporter of his. This is probably a follower from this area. So when the disciples say the Lord needs it, it's really not that weird. This is probably someone who knew Jesus and followed him. And Matthew tells us they brought the colt and the donkey. They brought the colt and its mother because Jesus is going to ride this thing, and it's never been ridden before. So if he gets on the back of this baby donkey that's never been ridden before and mommy's not there, it's going to be bad. So they bring the mother too to reassure it. And then Matthew tells us something that Luke doesn't tell us. And you don't have to go there, but I'm going to go to Matthew's account in Matthew chapter 21. And after Jesus sends the disciples away to get the colt, Matthew says, "This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. Say to the daughter of Zion," which is Jerusalem, "See, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." So Jesus is doing this to fulfill prophecy. And this is actually a prophecy from the book of Zechariah. It's Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. And Zechariah was a prophet from way back in the Old Testament. And he was preaching to the people when they had returned from exile and were rebuilding the temple. And Zechariah is actually the most messianic book in the Old Testament. It has more content in it about Jesus than any other book in the Old Testament. Now, it doesn't have the most prophecies about him because it's a pretty short book, but when you look at percentage-wise, what percentage of the book is about Jesus, it's more about Jesus than any other Old Testament book. And one of the things he said was, as you're looking ahead for this king, as you're looking ahead for this Messiah, one of the ways you'll know it's him is he's going to come to you riding on a donkey. And Jesus rides in on a donkey. See, this is huge. This is Jesus finally presenting himself in public as the Messiah. Jesus is deliberately, publicly presenting himself as king. Let's move on. We're in verse 36 now. As we keep reading, Luke says, "As Jesus went along, people spread their cloaks on the road. When he came near the place where the road goes down the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began joyfully to praise God in loud voices for all the miracles they'd seen. 'Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest.'" Now Luke references people. There were a lot of people around while this was going on, not just the 12 disciples. But remember, Jesus he's been traveling, he's been teaching, he's got his entourage built up at this point from the last 6 months. And not only that, there were hundreds of thousands of Jews pouring in from all over the Roman Empire for Passover. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims every year would come for this feast, and many of them would come over the Mount of Olives and go into Jerusalem the way Jesus was. So there are a lot of people around when this is going on. And Luke says they begin to spread their cloaks on the road. Matthew and Mark say they were waving branches, and John says they were palm branches. They were waving them or laying them down on the road in front of him. And these are regal gestures. The palm branch, it was a political symbol. So what they're doing when they're laying this stuff down before Jesus, they're basically bowing down before him, acknowledging and honoring him as king, that they're bowing down to him and welcoming him as their king. And he's on the road, he's on the other side of the mountain now, he's going down to Jerusalem. And Luke says the whole crowd is praising God. And again, this is a lot of people. Think like Thanksgiving Day in the city, okay? I mean, the road is lined on both sides with people who are shouting praises to God. And when we look at how they praised God, we see that they're receiving Jesus as their king. One of the things they said is, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord." That's from Psalm 118, which is a psalm about the Messiah. It's also the same psalm that says, "The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." I don't know if you remember that one, but that's a psalm that's quoted a lot in the New Testament. Matthew says they call him the son of David, and they say, "Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David." And the prophets would talk about Messiah and call him David. So again, they're calling him their king. And we just sang the song Hosanna. They were also saying Hosanna, which literally means save. But at that point, it was just a praise word. So they're praising Jesus, they're praising God, they're receiving Jesus as their king and as their Messiah, and they're ready to take him into the temple and swear him in as king. And the leaders understood this. The Jewish leaders got it. They saw what the crowd was trying to do, and they didn't like it. So let's keep reading in verse 39. Luke says, "Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, 'Teacher, rebuke your disciples.' 'I tell you,' he replied, 'if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out.' As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, 'If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it's hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you didn't recognize the time of God's coming to you.'" So the religious leaders, they hear the things the people are saying, and they're telling Jesus, like, "You got to shut them up. You got to shut this thing down. They can't say these things to you." Because they knew that the people were calling Jesus the Messiah, and to them, that was blasphemy. They didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah. So to let people call you the son of David, to receive praises from the people like that was blasphemy. Someone couldn't do that. And this was also subversive. I mean, you have to understand, this was under the Roman Empire, and there were Roman troops stationed in Jerusalem to keep the peace. Especially during a festival time like this, the Jews could get very riotous. They could really get whipped up into a frenzy. And when you have an empire as vast as the Romans did, you constantly have to shut down rebellions throughout the empire. And so here we have hundreds of thousands of people coming to Passover, proclaiming Jesus as king. And the Jewish leaders are getting nervous because they know if Jesus whips up this crowd into a frenzy, and if he tries to take the throne, the Romans could just come and kill everyone. So they're saying, "Jesus, you got to shut this down. You can't let them do this. Make them be quiet." And Jesus says, "No." There's no. If they stop, the stones will start. This is happening. They're going to praise me whether you guys like it or not. But then he does something surprising. As he approaches Jerusalem and he's looking out over the city, he starts to cry. So all his disciples all around him, they're praising God, they're receiving him as king, they're almost worshiping him, and Jesus starts bawling. I mean, it doesn't seem very triumphant, does it? But he's looking out over the city, and he knows what's going to happen, and he's lamenting for Jerusalem because he knows that in 40 years, the Romans are going to come and burn the city to the ground because they rejected him. And so he starts crying, and his heart is broken for them. And after this, there's a little bit of a gap. Now, in Luke's account, Jesus goes right into the temple area, and he clears it out. So we get the idea from Luke that this all happened on the same day. From Matthew and Mark, we know that this actually happens the next day. What happens is Jesus goes into the temple, he rides into the temple, and then the sick start coming to him, and he heals them, and then the children start running around and praising him, and then he leaves and he goes out to the Mount of Olives to spend the night, and then Mark says he comes back the next morning, Monday morning, and that's when he clears the temple. So knowing that, let's keep going in verse 45. Luke says, "Then Jesus entered the temple area and began driving out those who were selling. 'It is written,' he said to them, 'My house will be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers.' Every day he was teaching at the temple, but the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the leaders among the people were trying to kill him. Yet they couldn't find any way to do it, because all the people hung on his words." So the next day, Monday, when Jesus goes back into the temple, he's approaching from the east. So he goes into the outermost court, the court of the Gentiles. And this was a place where non-Jews could come and pray and worship God. And he's really disturbed by what he sees there, and he goes berserk. I mean, he starts flipping tables over, flipping benches over. He's driving people out. And what's happening there is there's people exchanging money, because every year the Jews had to pay the temple tax, so they had to exchange their Roman money for Jewish money in order to pay that tax. And people were also selling animals there, because if you're coming from far away, you can't bring your animals for sacrifice with you. You just have to buy them when you get there. And they were supposed to be doing that. The Old Testament law tells them to do this and to provide these services, but the way they were doing it was wrong. They were doing it dishonestly and making a profit, and they were doing it in a distracting way. They were making it more about business than worship. In fact, they were turning worship into a business, and that's why Jesus says you've turned it into a den of robbers. And so he's driving them out and cleansing the temple. And then Luke tells us that he taught every day at the temple during the last week of his life. So let's just get a real quick overview of the last week of Jesus' life here, because we know what happens to him every day. Sunday, we have Palm Sunday, which was the triumphal entry, which we just talked about. Monday, he comes back and he drives out the temple, he cleanses the temple, which we just talked about. Tuesday is his big day of controversy, where the religious leaders are just barraging him with questions, and he answers all of their questions. And then later on Tuesday evening is when he goes out to the Mount of Olives and preaches his long sermon about the destruction of Jerusalem. On Wednesday, Judas agrees to betray him. On Thursday, he has the Last Supper with his disciples, which you've probably heard it called Maundy Thursday because of the mandate to do this in remembrance of me. So he has the Last Supper with them on Thursday, and that night he's arrested. And then Friday, he's put on trial, and he's crucified, and he's buried. So that is the final week of Jesus' life. And every day, the religious leaders are trying to find a way to kill him, but they can't, because they don't have the people on their side. The people hung on Jesus' words, Luke says. Mark says they listened to him with delight. The people loved Jesus, so there was nothing the leaders could do to stop him. So we see that on Sunday, during the triumphal entry, the crowds received Jesus as their king. But then when you flip ahead a little bit later in Luke, something confusing happens. They reject him as king. They receive him on Sunday, and then a few days later on Friday, they reject him. And this is really confusing. You read in Luke chapter 23, Jesus is standing trial before Pilate, and 3 times Pilate says, "There's nothing wrong with this guy. You don't have anything to bring against him. You got nothing on him. I'm going to release him to you." And 3 times the people say, "No, kill him, crucify him, execute him." How do you explain that? I have no idea. I really don't know how they went from receiving him on Sunday to rejecting him on Friday, because the Gospels don't tell us how this happened. Luke doesn't explain it. None of the Gospels explain it. I don't understand how this can happen, but it did. I mean, there's a few reasons we can guess. One is maybe it was a different crowd. Maybe, we read in the Gospel of John that every time Jesus goes to Jerusalem, it's a little bit of a tougher crowd there. The people from Jerusalem, the city people, tend to resist him a little bit more. The country folk in Galilee like him a lot more than the city folk in Jerusalem. So maybe that's the difference. Maybe all the people on Friday morning who want him killed are the people from the city who never really liked him to begin with. But maybe it's just from the pressure from the religious leaders. We know the leaders were pressuring the people to accuse Jesus falsely and to call for his execution. Even then, in Acts chapter 1, Luke tells us that once Jesus goes to heaven 2 months later, once he ascends back into heaven, there's only 120 Christians anyway. And I get the impression that there were a lot more than 120 people praising him at the triumphal entry. So however we explain it, there's still a lot of people who received him on Sunday and then rejected him on Friday. And I really don't know how to explain it. My best guess is that Jesus didn't meet their expectations. He rode into Jerusalem, and he didn't do what the people expected him to do. And so by the end of the week, they rejected him. See, they received him as king, but not on his terms. They might have received him, but they received him on their own terms instead of his. See, they expected a conquering king, and they got a suffering servant. They expected a military leader, and they got a spiritual deliverer. They expected an earthly kingdom. He set up a heavenly kingdom. Jesus came not to be served, but to serve. He came not to conquer, but to give his life as a ransom for many. And he came not to overthrow Rome, but to seek and save the lost. And that's really the only thing I can think of, is that the crowds received Jesus, but they received him on their terms and not his. And so whenever their faith in him was put under pressure and put to the test, they cracked, and they ended up rejecting him. And I think that's instructive for us. The crowds give us an example of how not to be mature, because they received Jesus on their own terms. And if we're going to be mature in our faith, and if we're going to truly receive Jesus as our King, we have to accept him on his terms, not ours. See, our terms, one of our terms is comfort. We want to receive Jesus as King, but we still want our lives to be comfortable. We really don't want to sacrifice anything. We really don't want to give anything up. We really don't want anything to change. Another one of our terms is convenience. We receive Jesus as our King, but we want it to be convenient to worship him. So we'll work him in maybe an hour on Sundays or an hour on Wednesdays as we can at our leisure. But one of our terms is convenience, and we want to worship Jesus conveniently. Another one of our terms, I think, is we put boundaries on Jesus, especially as adults. We receive Jesus as our King, and we say, okay, Jesus, here's my life. Here's the boundaries. Here's the parameters. Here's the life I've established for myself. And you can be my king, but your realm only goes this far. You can rule over me, but it's got to be within these boundaries. You got to stay within these parameters. So we receive Jesus, but we receive him on our own terms instead of his. And his terms are a lot different. One of his terms is sacrifice. He says, you got to leave everything to follow me. Another one of his terms is obedience. If Jesus tells you to do something, he expects you to do it. He doesn't care if it's hard. He doesn't care if it doesn't work out well for you. He's the king, and if he tells you to do something, you got to do it. Another one of Jesus' terms is no boundaries. You can't put boundaries on Jesus. You can't come to him and say, you can only rule this far. No, he's the king. You don't put boundaries on Jesus. Those are his terms. He even said himself that his terms were deny yourself and take up your cross daily. And we know that he wasn't exaggerating, because after he rides into Jerusalem, he goes and does it. He does the very thing that he told his disciples they had to do. So we see that you can't accept Jesus on your own terms. You can't receive him and then put limitations on him. We serve a king who suffered and died for his own cause. So why would he expect any less of us? And this brings up, at least for me, this brings back the tension of being a first world Christian. I know we've talked about this before. Because all around the world today, people are receiving Jesus on his terms. I heard from a couple people already this morning on the news. They saw that 2 churches just today were blown up. It was, one said Egypt and one said Syria. Which one is it? In Egypt? Yeah, 2 churches just this morning. Their buildings were blown up during their Palm Sunday worship services, like what we're doing now. All around the world, people are accepting Jesus on his terms and not their own. And so I struggle with this. How do we reconcile following Jesus with freedom of religion? Because we aren't persecuted, but most Christians around the world are. And I struggle with that. Now, I'm not stupid. If you give me a choice between being persecuted and not being persecuted, I'm going to pick not being persecuted. Like, that's a no-brainer, right? I don't think any persecuted Christian in the world asks for that to happen to them. But we have to wrestle with the fact that in the Gospels, Jesus says you're going to suffer, you're going to die, and then he suffers and dies, and then we don't suffer. That's hard for me. And I would never want that to happen, but there is something about persecution. It's kind of like a refining fire. It really shows whether or not you've received Jesus on your terms or on his. Because when the suffering comes and the hardship comes, if you've received Jesus on your own terms, you're gonna reject him. You're going to fall away. You're not going to stand faithful if you've just received him on your own terms. And that refines entire churches too, because in our country, I feel like we might even have entire churches of people who've received Jesus on their own terms. Well, if you're in a country where you're persecuted, and there's another church in town that gets blown up, if you receive Jesus on your own terms, you're probably not going to go to church anymore, right? So it has this refining effect of distinguishing between who's received Jesus on his terms and who's received him on our terms. And so I think one way that we can tell how we've received Jesus is how willing we are to evangelize. That's kind of been our application this month, is telling people about Jesus and inviting them to church. And I'm not using this to try and manipulate you to invite people to church, okay? Don't hear that. But I really think a sign of someone who's received Jesus on his own terms is a willingness to evangelize. Because people who receive Jesus on their terms, they don't really want to talk about it, right? They have their religion. It's this private, tucked away corner of their lives. They don't really want to bring it to work with them. They don't really want to bring it to school with them. They don't really want to stand out for it. And even all of us, we feel that too. Like, we want to be faithful to Jesus, but we don't want to be known as like the Jesus person, right? Like, standing out for him is kind of a tough thing to do. But I think when you receive Jesus on your own terms, you're willing to do that because he teaches you that everywhere you go and everyone you know is an opportunity to serve him and to tell people about him. And one of the sacrifices we can make is our reputation, is the way we're known socially, is, maybe we have to give up that image that we want to have with other people. Which might happen if you start talking about Jesus. So I want to conclude this week the way I concluded last week. I want to ask you, who are your three? Last week I encouraged you to pick 3 unsafe people in your life and to write down their names and to begin praying for them, to begin praying that Jesus would save them. And I encouraged you to post their names somewhere you would see it and to actually pray for them during the week. Did anybody do that? Anybody do that this past week? A couple? Awesome. Well, I want to give you a chance to do it again today. On the bottom of your handout, there's a list that says, who are your 3? And just think about 3 unsafe people in your life that you can start praying for, that the Lord would soften their heart to the gospel and give them an opportunity to hear it. And I want to remind you, the harvest is plentiful. We live on an island of over 7 million people. And there are people who need to hear about Jesus and people who would probably respond to him if we would invite them. And next week is Easter Sunday. This is a perfect time of year to start sharing your faith. This is a perfect time of year to invite someone to church. This is a time of year that people are probably most willing to receive an invitation to church. And something we have to help you with that is just this little invite card. I showed you these last week. They might be in the pockets on the back of the seat in front of you. If not, there's some on the tables in the side lobby and in the back. But this just has our service times on it for Good Friday and for Easter Sunday. Last week I told you only take 1. This week you can take as many as you want, because after today they're no good to us anymore. So you can take as many as you want today. But I'd encourage you, be praying for people. Invite people to church. They're going to hear the gospel. And we're going to end the same way we did last week. Michelle's going to give us a minute or 2, and I'm not going to pray, but you guys are going to pray. Pray for the people on your list. Pray for your 3. Pray that the Lord would soften their heart and that they would hear the gospel, and that you might even be the one who has the chance to share it with them.